Hey guys, today we paint the Eurasian Pygmy OWL, which is more common in Northern Europe up to Siberia. It is a very small owl, maybe 17 centimeters tall, and I was quite lucky to come eye to eye with one. But I'll tell you more about it in the course of the video, so have a look. I made a pre-drawing of the Eurasian Pygmy OWL, mainly because my birds still look a little bit similar to the abstract drawings of a 3-year-old. I add a little bit of masking fluid, or a little bit more of masking fluid on some of the feathers. So if you want to see where exactly, because I can see from the video that it's slightly more difficult to see white masking fluid on white paper, have a look at the end of the video what the owl actually looks like, and you get the idea where the masking fluid has been applied. Then I start to apply some indigo blue with a very big brush. I made a lot of paint of it because I use it as a background, but then I use also burnt amber mixed with some deep yellow. I use some burnt sienna as the first layers and some crimson red as well as turquoise blue. And the brown is basically mixed out of burnt amber and some indigo blue or some turquoise blue. I spread the indigo blue in the background and I make sure that there's a loads of paints. Then I add here and there of a turquoise blue, which is mixing quite well with the indigo blue in the background. I try to be careful not to paint over the owl, as well as adding some more splashes of the indigo blue and much more paint at the right side as well as a little bit at the left side, but more in a kind of like abstract way. I take off a little bit of the paint so it's not like accumulating much, and I add some water there at the neck of the owl, so it creates a little bit of those stains, but here it was quite intended. Occasionally I leave here and there a little bit of some space so it's not that overcrowded, and adding some brown burnt amber mixed with the blue. Continuing to work on the other side while it's still wet. While the bottom half of the painting is still wet, I add about this darker brown, which is kind of mixing with the blues, so I won't kind of like have this wet to wet effect. I leave a little bit of a white space underneath, so it's kind of like with the hard edges, and then I continue to paint underneath the wings of the owl. Here and there I add a little bit of a light turquoise blue. And then I add some salt. I have noticed with this paper that if you add salt even on the wet paper, it's not blossoming that well. It doesn't give the right effect, so I add more paint of the darker brown, and while everything is still wet, so it kind of like really comes out. Then I continue with the head of the owl, and I wetted it a little bit on the edge, and then I add some more turquoise blue and really burnt amber. It's like really light in color and they're mixing nicely together. It's like a little bit like burnt amber and sienna. And then here and there adding already like darker colors of the brown. This is actually a very small painting, so I use small brushes, and here I add more of the brown, but before I have taken off a little bit of the paint. I try not to overdo it, So I add more, a little bit of a clean water and then more paint. Well, it's still kind of connecting with each other, so it kind of has this flow effect. And then adding sienna and burnt amber mixture and a little bit of the darker brown around the beak of the owl. Here I actually directly some dark indigo blue, so it's kind of like, so it gives a really nice effect. And then more reddish brown at the top of the owl, and start working myself forward. A little bit darker brown with some spots here and there. And then I add a little bit more of the indigo blue, so it's still mixing with the other colors, which means that the other colors are quite wet. I continue with the eye. It's kind of like a little bit brownish and bluish color, so it turns already a little bit gray. But to emphasize the eye, I add more of those reddish brown, so like burnt amber, and then spreading it carefully with the brush around. Occasionally I add a little bit of the bluish colors underneath the eye and some more water to spread it, so it's not everything, so that not everything is really that dark. Spots here and there with some more brown and some more reddish brown. I actually had the pleasure to meet one of those Eurasian pygmy owls, because we have a feeding place for the birds over the winter. I always in the morning there are many swarms of birds, especially of the yellow hammers, but also different other birds like those great tits or blue tits. And one morning when I went to put more seeds into the bird feeding area, I actually went and it was really empty. So I was wondering, oh, maybe there's a predator bird or somewhere around. And I looked down and I first thought it's was it blackbird? Because we had one of those as well. But it kept staring at me and I was like, oh no, it's not a blackbird. What is it? Why is it staring at me? And I looked a little bit closer and it actually was one of the small owls. Unfortunately, or fortunately for itself, it got one of the yellow hammers birds, and it kept looking at me, and then it flew away with the bird within its claws. It was nice to see the bird, but I actually did feel really sorry for the bird that got eaten. But at the end of the day, all birds need food, so it was the bird feeding places are great hunting area for the predators birds. Here I continue already with the wing, and I also add more and more salt on it when it's still really wet. And it's kind of like a mixture out of those red, brown and sienna and darker browns, so here and there. I try not to overmix it, so for example if I start with a darker color and then I add more of the lighter colors, or the other way around. Here we have a little bit of the darker brown on the belly side already, and adding some with light brush strokes, adding some feathers, and then continue with the turquoise blue, which is still a little bit mixing with brown. And then here I add a little bit, while it's really wet, I add some brown to the belly of the owl, and then adding here and there a little bit more of those darker browns, so I start to add more of the dark colors rather than the light colors. Now I continue with the branch, Oh, underneath the branch actually, because the branch is ready. I add the same colors as before, so some indigo blue, some turquoise blue. Here I add some branches which are a little bit further away, so they're kind of like mixing with the blues. Now I've focused a little bit more onto the eye and adding more of the reddish blue, not adding more of the reddish brown. Here I added a little bit too much of the color, so it's kind of, when it's too wet, it's quite easy to take off. Now focus on the beak, which has basically the same color. And if you think there's like, okay, I put too much paint, just simply take it off. I think with the beak I had a little bit of difficulties because it's so small, and to make it more pronouncing, adding here more of the darker brown and a little bit of the blue. Also continuing with the second eye on the right. But I added here more of the darker blue. Then I spread a little bit the darker colors. I thought maybe it looks better. It didn't that much, so I had to take off the color, the paint with the tissue. And adding some more blue underneath the beak and underneath the eye. Now I add more of the details here and there. So basically the first layer is done and dusted and it's dried out. So it's more now focusing on small of the details, emphasizing some of the shapes of the owl. About the owl itself, they are actually quite curious creatures. They are quite common like Northern Europe, but as well as Central Europe, and they are not endangered yet. Those owls are very territorial. They nest in woodpeckers' holes, especially if they are big enough, and they use those holes for nesting, maybe for 7 years. Then they look for their partners during the autumn time, which I thought it was quite interesting, and around the springtime. They're quite monogamous, which means that once a partner has found another, they're staying together for the one season and maybe even for seasons afterwards. And during the nesting time, one owl or one female might lay 4 to 7 eggs, and during this time the male feeds the female. I have been painting the head of the owl and adding a little bit brownish colors and a little bit reddish colors. So sometimes I mix the burnt umber with the crimson red to make it a little bit more red. And adding here and there a little bit of paint, for example, to the lower wing of the owl as it's a little bit turned, and spreading it slightly to create more structure and also some more round shape. I make sure that sometimes I use a little bit water to spread the paint. Now I'll continue with the back wing, and also adding a little bit more structure and a little bit more of brownish colors. Basically a second layer, and kind of in a form that showing the different feathers, but not completely in detail. it is more like adding a layer after layer. I continue to work more on the beak, adding a little bit more of orange, my orange but really like reddish brown, as well as the back of the head, and then spreading it lightly with some water. And I think here you can see where I added the masking film at the top of the head, so they are like little spots. Then I continue with the reddish brown on the back wing, especially at the right side, but also in the middle. And leaving also so occasionally hot edges, so it's not all the time like wet to wet. And then occasionally giving more colors to the places. I have already added loads of darker paint, but it was maybe not as strong in the pigment, so adding a little bit more here and there. Now I'm adding a little bit more of the adding more paint, more brown on the one side of the feathers, which is sticking out a little bit more. I thought maybe it would be a good idea as well, adding a little bit more of the turquoise blue underneath the wings. And a little bit emphasizing with a much more darker colors underneath the owl itself. So it's kind of like really sticking out, especially as the owl is, the belly of the owl is not as dark. And then the branch is getting a little bit more structure as well, so it's kind of like in a also in a round shape, adding some more brown so it's not completely flat and it's underneath the owl itself. And then adding a little bit more darker colors, and which are emphasizing the single feathers, especially at the tail of the owl, adding a little bit more stronger colors in V shapes. Doing a little bit here and there, some little spots. I believe I had the first indigo blue, so darker blue, and adding a little bit more of the black or Payne's grey. And here again I paint a little bit more of the feathers separately. I believe in this video I actually have forgotten to paint the second eye, so you have to paint it basically the same time as you do the first eye. I wet the side next to the belly, and I add some different kinds of blue there, so it kind of really emphasizes the belly because it's very light in color. And then adding here again a little bit of the reddish color, where I thought, oh, it looks a little bit better. And at the top I add more of the darkest colors around the eye, but not too much. Just little spots here and there to emphasize those little feathers, and around the masking fluid a little bit of the reddish brown, because it kind of like, when you take the masking fluid away, it kind of emphasizes a little bit the white spots. here I took away with a wet, I brushed the top of the beak. Continue the same at the back of the owl, adding some indigo blue where I have wetted the background a little bit more, and so it's kind of like, okay, this white feathers, and it's kind of sticking out more if you add dark colors. I like to work at the background a little bit later because you have a more idea what it looks like. And then to create a little bit of a balance, I added some reddish brown. We are done here. I thank you for watching and remember to subscribe.